All right, welcome everyone, and thank you to those who stuck around from the last recording. Um, FirePheonix, and I will be doing a brief overview of fandom and censorship because as I've looked into this, I have gone down at 15, 20 rabbit holes, and I was like, each of those could be entirely their own topic, so I'm going to need to skim. So, what I'm doing is a brief overview of fandom, and I'm defining that as a group of people who really, really like a story. Fandom's history. I'm mainly focusing on Western literature and performed literature like stage or movies. One, because most of those are in English, and that's what I can read. And two, I had to narrow it down somehow. And I'll also be discussing censorship, words, suppressing literature or performed literature because either a dislike of the content or the ideas of the content. I will, when it comes to fandom history up till from ancient to probably get around 1990s, it will be very brief and just a mention of what happened. When we get into when fandom got on the internet, that's kind of where I got involved personally. So I have more to say on that. And also there is a fair amount of it written down. I'm going to be working from a fair amount of resources. I will post a link to everything at the end. I went lazy and went Wikipedia. But the other one I use a lot of was a site called Fanlore, which is kind of a history of fandom. And it's similar to Wikipedia in that it's a wiki type setup. All right, so I'm going to start with Iliad and the Odyssey. Talked about it is Iliad literally translates to a poem of Troy, or as a terrible Tumblr post I saw said, Troy story. The Odyssey was basically Odysseus had a terrible trip home, and both of these were supposedly written by Homer, who was a Greek in about 8th century BC. There's a bunch of ideas that they could have been previously verbal poems or, people talking back and forth, several ideas together, but the versions that we have were written down at about 8th century BC. What we have coming out of these, and kind of what I would almost view as a fan fiction, is we have the Aeneid, which I had to look up how to pronounce that, and I really hope I got that right. The Aeneid is a Latin poem. It was written much, much later, so 29th or 19 BC by Virgil. So what Virgil did was created an original character, a Trojan who traveled to Italy and became the Roman's ancestor. So basically he created an original character and went, this is our entire country's history, and then he borrowed a bunch of poetry and styles from the already existing poems of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Another thing, it's hexameter verse, book divisions, list of genealogy, underlying themes. So they were trying to, one of the things the Romans did a lot was they went into a culture and they borrowed a lot of it. And so this is an example of, I would almost define this as fan fiction. They really, really like these stories and they made it their own and tied it to them. So, yes, borrowed, after conquering and all that jazz. And I'm doing a quick, here is a lovely picture of, I believe this is our main character escaping Troy in a very dramatic picture. Also, another fun thing about Rome, it's where we get the word censor itself. So basically, a censor was a magistrate in ancient Rome who was responsible for maintaining the census, supervising public morality, and overseeing certain aspects of the government's finances. So the power of the censors was absolute, and no magistrate could oppose their decisions. Only another censor who succeeded them could cancel it. So that's where, in total, we got the word censorship. And I've got some more lovely of, if the internet decides to cooperate, of some ancient pictures of censors. I'm going to do a little bit of a time skip. Not much. And I'm going to reference another fandom, I will call it, that got a little big, and I would call that the Christian Bible. If any of you have ever seen a History of the World video on YouTube, there's a thing in that. You could make a religion out of that, and they did. So we've got the Christian Bible was sort of put together in about AD 325 in the Council of Nicaea. So we have a thing that came out of that to kind of present the Bible to the people, was something called a mystery play. These were possibly developed as early as the 5th century. They really, really hit their stride in about the 9th to the 14th century. Basically what these did was they put on a play of the Bible, stories in kind of one. It was maybe a picture with a song that went along with it. So people were in costume and stood there and represented something. So you got like creation and Adam and Eve and Last Judgment, all that fun stuff. And they would have them in like cycles. So they could last for days. You got to have public entertainment. It's very important for morale. Name itself, mystery, means miracle. However, going back to that censorship thing, in 1210, suspicious of the growing popularity of miracle plays, Pope Innocent III issued a papal edict forbidding clergy from acting on the public stage. This had the effect of transferring the organization of the dramas to town guilds. And we got some changes. So we got their everyday language instead of them in Latin. And some non-biblical passages were added along with some comic scenes. And I'm going to reference, I was in a play that I helped out at my college. They actually performed one of these miracle plays. It was called Every Man and Others, and Every Man was very much a morality play, very solemn and serious. The Others part was a little more interesting. There's one called The Second Shepherd's Play, and they end up going to see Jesus in the Nativity, but first, they have to rescue a sheep that was hidden in a cradle by two robbers, one of whom is the town drunk. And they're popping in and out of doors, and they're pretending that the sheep is a baby. They go and see Jesus, but it's mostly about the theft. And the last performance the group I worked with did, for some reason, they decided to do the play, every single one of them having a different accent. So that was a level of chaos that I'd never quite seen. Everything had fallen apart. But medieval play, Scottish accent, you have some guy with an African accent, whatever. But I think that reached the level of silliness that these plays could get to, which I could see why that would make the clergy nervous. And the particular performance I saw, it made the director put his head in his hands and walk away. Also around the same time, we get King Arthur. King Arthur, based on possibly a 5th century king. We had a couple different books that kind of labeled him as a historical figure, but most of the King Arthur myth is they've taken every single story about knights and kind of smashed it together. Some of the big ones where we've got Geoffrey of Monmouth's, he had something called History of the Kings of Britain, and you've got some Welsh works. And since we've got the Welsh background, we have some very creative uses of Guinevere's name. One of which I believe that someone I saw, here is a copy of how her name is spelled. Gwenhwyfar. And a comment from someone online was, "Aren't you glad we've stopped naming women after horse noises?" So we've got a bunch of different backgrounds there. And so we've got Geoffrey. He was a king who defeated the Saxons, had a vast empire. And then we get to a 12th century French writer who added Lancelot. And it turned more into a romance. So instead of it went from King Arthur, it went to all the side characters. We currently have some background noise. And then we also have, this was one I couldn't find a direct source for, but I found a reference online. Eleanor of Aquitaine was locked in a tower for a while, and she liked stories about knights and stuff like that and romance. So we got a bunch more of King Arthur stories or stories in that vein because she wanted to read things about herself. We've also got a few other, we've got a few other things, but the censorship in King Arthur is interesting. It comes a little later. We get to Victorian times and we have Tennyson's Idylls of the King, where they took out all the naughty bits. So, story you heard about Arthur sleeping with his sister. Yeah, that part's, we're just gonna not mention that. It might upset people. So we're up to Victorian times. Gonna mention one of the fandoms that is still around in large numbers thanks to about 5 million different versions of said story. Sherlock Holmes. This was one where I think the power of people being fans of things first showed up. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle really, really, really disliked his character. So much, in fact, he killed him off. As you can probably imagine, people were not happy at all. So, about 3 to 5 years later, much to his disappointment, Doyle had to bring him back to life. And I'm just going to briefly mention Tolkien, huge fandom. It was one that generated a lot of both fan fiction, early fan fiction, and I'll show a couple links to that. But it was one where it had so much stuff. I found a paper that put Tolkien, stuff written about Tolkien up to 1964, and the paper was 27 pages long. So Professor Tolkien managed to bring about a ton of research and all of that stuff. One of the authors who actually wrote a fair amount of this Tolkien works is Marion Zimmer Bradley. For those of you not familiar, she is also the Darkover books. She wrote The Mists of Avalon. But she also was responsible for a fair amount of fanzine. So her Tolkien fandom activities, she wrote one, a fanzine called Astra's Tower. It's called Men, Halflings, and Hero Worship. She wrote a crossover story where Aragorn entered her own created world of Darkover. She had a single issue of a fanzine she called Andorel, but she wrote a lot of actual fandom activity very, very early on. And this was one where I ran across this while studying, and I didn't know that this type of thing was this early. So this leads us to the fandom that a lot of people think as kind of starting the very, very vocal fandom movement. Star Trek. Star Trek was canceled, and through a very, very active letter writing campaign, was brought back to TV. Also, I found a bit of history. This is, let me scroll back far enough. This is the very first Star Trek fan fiction ever written. 1974. And it's very short, but we have the actual, and of course it's a Kirk Spock fan fiction complete with artwork. And it's I think it's really, really cool as we've gotten to this point where people have been invested enough in these fandoms to want to put some additional work into it, to want to write about it, to want to create art for it. And also in creating stuff, they're creating things that they couldn't see on TV. While Star Trek was ahead of its time, Kirk Spock was never going to be a thing in the 1960s and early 70s. So we had fan fiction that kind of filled that gap of what people wanted to see. And Star Trek is obviously still a huge fandom. I mean, we just got Picard on TV. So this is definitely one of the, also I would refer it as a grandfather fandom. It's been around, they're established. They also helped come up with cons. Like Star Trek really, really brought people together, and you started having these huge cons, and you started having these, you know, fans who were big name fans, because you've got the people who brought Trek together. They helped build a community. I'm going to skip about to the late 90s, early 2000s. This was in the wild, wild west of the internet. We have, I remember LiveJournal. I wasn't around as much for GeoCities. And this was a place where people who liked things could go and connect with other people in the fandom. Because while Star Trek was huge, it was kind of limited because fanzines would have to be mailed. If you had to be able to afford to go to a convention. We got the internet, and suddenly you didn't have to go anywhere to connect with other fans. LiveJournal and GeoCities kind of made a place online where people could come together and write about things they liked. Very, very much it was the power of the pocket, except here's where it gets a little dicey. LiveJournal itself was started in about 1999. We started getting a huge, huge jump in 2002. 2003, you no longer had to have, you no longer were required to be invited. You could just move to it. What happened is two things happened. One was there were a couple authors who their attitude toward fan fiction and fan works are not particularly kind. One of them is the author of the Vampire, Chronicles of the Vampire, Anne Rice. I believe she threatened several sites with legal problems. And that kind of made these sites scared because they didn't realize it was kind of a gray area. And Also, we got a group called Warriors for Innocence in, I'd say it ran about 2005 to 2007, and their goals were hunting pedophiles where they fester. And so they would go after specific things on LiveJournal, and they claimed that these were violating what is called the TOS agreement, which is terms of service agreement on the site. And the problem was what they were going after and what led to the terms of agreement were tended to be things that anything outside of a straight relationship. Or it would even go to, I don't like this pairing. There is a current thing from one of the leaders, which was going after same-sex pairings and quoting the Bible and going, here's this thing, I hate it. Also, pedophilia, young, old, all this fun stuff. There is links for this. And this was the interesting one. They said they went after incest, but what they pointed out, and I could tell it was a pairing they didn't like, was they said that Harry and Hermione fell into this category. Which, I've got a quote where it says, yes, I know that Harry and Hermione are not technically brother and sister, but they view each other as that, and thus support to them as an act against God. And it got really, really nasty. And the problem was they had enough people behind them that there was what happened on LiveJournal was something called strike through and bold through. People who had these certain tags, their stuff was just wiped away. They had absolutely no protection. This included journals that would mention rape, domestic violence, BDSM, prostitution, and that got rid of some groups that were like rape survivor blogs or book discussion groups or anything that kind of fell out of this category of a very, very narrow view of what was right. So you had authors who would wake up and all their work that they put on there was just gone. And it was a paid, the thing about LiveJournal was you had to pay to be on there. It would, and I'm going to do a quote from a Tumblr I found, and it is very similar to what's happening currently. So, this is a Tumblr user called Red Shoes and Blue Skies. Says she went to college, says, in 2003, 5 years later, I came back to fandom because I started rereading Discworld, and you had to find pieces. It was the here and there. We also had fan fiction going on, so the same thing was happening on fan fiction. And basically, what was happening was that things were just being wiped away because it didn't match what was happening or what people wanted, what this particular group wanted to see. And it's interesting, this was about the time that I was online, and so I saw fanfiction.net got rid of its stories rated M because they were afraid of being sued. And just all of these things were happening, and there wasn't any protection for the authors. And this is where it gets interesting, is you would also, I'm going to pause for a moment. Okay. Apologies, I needed to find the next thing. You've got things where it was just panic and outrage and nobody knew what was going on. they felt like they were being treated like criminals. And basically what this did was it killed LiveJournal. And out of LiveJournal came Archive of Our Own. Archive of Our Own is a group that is owned. It's managed by fans. It doesn't have any advertisements. It writes in its terms of agreement that they are there to protect the authors. If you don't want to read it, you are in charge of your own experience. And I think that's something that online a lot of people have forgotten, that just because it's out there doesn't mean that you have to read it or you have to consume it. That's your choice. And going after people who choose to read that or choose to write that makes you a shitty person. Which, one of the things is, I am very grateful because Archive of Our Own kind of centralized a bunch of fandoms and made it one place where you could go and find any fan fiction you wanted. And parental supervision. We're going to get to that. And this kind of brought it to real life for me. So, from the United States, I'm from Missouri, and about 2 weeks ago, we had a Missouri senator proposed a bill that would allow for parental review boards to decide what content is suitable for minors in public libraries. According to the new proposed bill, libraries in Missouri could lose state funding, and librarians could even face jail time if they loan age-inappropriate materials to minors. So this is still going on. And obviously the response is, one, you're in charge of your own, experience. Don't look at stuff you don't read. And parents, supervise your own children. You get a group of parents, and if you get them all being the same type of person, some stories that might be deemed inappropriate are, one is called The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie. That is one of those books that has been banned multiple times. It's a story about a Native American who goes to a white school. And, it's got language, it's got references to stuff, and all that sort of thing. What's fascinating is I subbed once in a school that had the poverty level was low. It was a really, really diverse class. And I subbed for a class that was to catch up with reading, and they read that book and they wanted to read it because it was probably one of the first books they read where there was someone who looked and talked like them. So you get this is definitely the part where I get really, really, really angry, because if you don't want your kids to check out a book, supervise your children. Doesn't mean that you can get anywhere near what other people's children are. That's their job. And I'm going to quote, it's a Jamie Livingston, who is the director of the Adair County Public Library. She says, "I'm very discouraged by it because it's basically censorship. It's taking power away from librarians, and it's giving power if you read the bill. The bill calls for a group of 5 people to make up a special board that decides what library materials are allowed in the library and what type of library programs are allowed in the library. And basically that's censorship." So kind of the point of all this is people have liked stories for a long time. People have been trying to prevent other people from learning stories for just as long. And so if you see stuff like this, call it out. Because this, I believe there's currently a group of drag queens who are going to be marching on the Missouri Capitol, because one of the things that they're also like is they shouldn't have drag queen story time at the library for kids. If you don't want your kids to go to drag queen story time, don't take your kids. And it's also something to keep in mind as you're encountering other people in fandoms. You may not like what they have to say about it, but they have as much right to say that, because doing otherwise is censorship. And I do believe I have worked myself up into a tizzy, and I believe I will bring this to an end. I will be dropping the links and kind of my brief outline of things and a whole bunch of other links that I didn't get anywhere near getting down into the chat. Thank you all.